crisis. My planet sent to me a glacier melting rapidly. On the second day of climate crisis,
I'm ready. I'm always ready.
I was expecting you to turn up with the Christmas hat or the
No, no, no,
beard.
no, no. That's not me. My son does that in his school. This is kind of a Danish thing.
On the third day of climate crisis, my planet sent to me 3 toxic spills, 2 species lost, and a glacier melting.
A very warm welcome, everybody, to a special edition of Business for Humanity, your monthly dose of revolutionism for all those people who care about making our planet and our businesses a tiny little bit better. And today with a special theme, which is sustainability retrospective. And I'm very, very happy to have with us Andreas Rasche from the Copenhagen Business School. Hey, Andreas.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you.
I don't know how to say good morning in Danish anymore.
Good morning. That's easy. Good morning.
And of course, a very warm welcome also to Antoinette Weibel, professor of the University of St. Gallen. Hey, Antoinette.
Hello.
We're connecting the beaches with the Alps on this call. Isn't that, that could be a nice theme to consider later. But as usual, let us dive into the call by a quick check-in. So if you want to share on the chat, and please use the chat throughout for any questions that you want us to pick up in the Q&A. We might open for live session as well later. 3 questions for you in the Q&A. Who are you? Where do you come from? And what's your role? And then one idea this morning. If you would give one eco-friendly gift to someone this holiday season, what would it be? Or what will it be if you have already made up your mind? Whilst you're thinking about that, and I'm sure some people will be watching now very closely because they need some ideas still for Christmas, I want to just point you briefly to our broader Business for Humanity inquiry. If anyone is interested, you can see the 8 paradigms which we have investigated so far in a comparative analysis of different alternatives or suggested alternatives to capitalism. Please have a look at businessforhumanity.world. And with that, let me also briefly introduce Andreas properly. Many of you will have come across Andreas on LinkedIn, in publications, in books. Andreas is a world leader in corporate sustainability and focusing on ESG, but also very often on governance and sustainable finance. He's the Associate Dean for the full-time MBA program at Copenhagen Business School. He is advisor and has collaborated with many different bodies. He's been the Associate Editor of Business Ethics Quarterly, a keynote speaker, and connected to many other academic networks, as you can see, the European Business Ethics Network. And again, Andreas, thank you so much for making the time. It's a great pleasure.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you, Otti. It's my pleasure to be here and speak to you. And thank you for this very generous introduction. I mean,
superb. And I will remind people later as well that we are very happy and pleased to post all of Andreas's posts and updates on sustainability at sustainability.leadershipsociety.world. So if you're interested in Andreas's writings, you will of course get a few of those today, but you can also have a look at all the posts and updates that Andreas is frequently and generously sharing online. And with that, let's have a look at what we've got in stock for this Christmas edition for you today. We're going to start the session with a retrospective. Like every good agile company, at some point, and ideally every 2 weeks, but we're going to do it annually, we should have a look at whether all these alternatives to capitalism, all these ideas to make capitalism better, are actually bearing fruits. Has it worked? Over the last 12 months, are we getting better or are we getting worse? So the challenge to Andreas was, can you, for every month of the year in 2024, find out what the most interesting, important events have been, and tell us what your overall impression is as to where we're landing. From there, we will go straight into a Q&A with Antoinette, where you can also put questions on the chat to understand better where we are, and also look at the top 5 naughty list and the top 5 nice list, where we're trying to find the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Innovators, those companies, bodies, institutions that might have done well. So we don't only want to dwell on the bad, we also want to look for moral exemplars. And From there, we will look into 2025. What do we need to be ready for? We might take it into another quick Q&A if you have questions, if Antoinette has further questions. And finally, we go into a plenary conversation to understand how can we make this Christmas season a little bit more eco-friendly. And finally, how should we make our businesses a little bit more sustainable in the next year? And then we wrap up with some resources that Andreas will share on where you can find the best information, the best useful practical advice for your commitments for 2025. That's the agenda for today. And I would say, let's go straight into the retrospective. I'm handing over to Andreas for this sustainability review.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Otti. Yes, and let me maybe say before we start, of course, I mean, this of course is an incomplete review. I will try to highlight kind of some things from my own posts on LinkedIn, but also from my own experiences throughout 2024, what has kind of shaped the debate, what was important, but of course, you can never capture everything. So please bear with me when for each month, of course, I can only kind of review one decisive news, so to say. So next slide, please, Otti. So in January, I think what moved me quite a bit in January was we came out of kind of this Christmas calmness, and suddenly something was on the agenda which seemed quite surprising, because in December actually we had a trilogue agreement on the due diligence directive, which is an important directive in the EU regarding value chain due diligence systems. And then in January we kind of got first information that there was kind of the liberals in Germany, they seem to disagree, despite the existence actually of this trilogue agreement. And this raised a lot of eyebrows back then. And I remember I put it on LinkedIn, and a lot of people said, yeah, that seems a bit strange, but actually nobody really thought that would be extremely consequential. I think what was underestimated at the time also by me was how powerful actually a small party in a large German government could be. And then they pushed, these kind of German liberals, they pushed throughout Europe, also other parties, to kind of block this trilogue agreement. And this then created a big political process with lots of ups and downs throughout the first half of the year for this due diligence directive. It was a bit unfortunate, I must say, because usually the process really goes, we have an agreement in the EU, and then this is being implemented. It is rubber stamped by the Council and the Parliament, and then we go through with it. This was not the case here, and I think this was very surprising start of the year. Let's move to February. So in February, there was one study that really caught my eye, and that was this very big survey coming out in Nature around climate and how people kind of also perceive climate change. So 69% of the world's population would contribute 1% of their monthly income to fight climate change, but only 43% believe that others would contribute as well. And that pointed out actually one of the important biases that we have in this field. A majority of people would actually act on climate if you consider this 1% context here. But this majority thinks it is the minority, and that of course makes things rather difficult. So this study created lots of discussions online, but also offline, and in different fora, and I think it is a very important study, also because it was a global survey, 120,000 people, so that really is significant in terms of also in terms of impact. In this sense, in this sense, of course, it is a good finding. And as I see one comment here, yes, it also of course gives hope, and that is the good thing, right? I mean, a lot of the studies that came out also throughout the year also give hope, because they also show that people care, and that people want climate change really to be addressed. The question at the end of the day is, how much are people willing to sacrifice for it? So here in this particular context, they work with this 1% of monthly income. Let's go to March. Then in March, yeah, I mean, that was something where also quite a lot of the attention then was moved again towards climate change. And what came out was one very interesting study from Carbon Tracker, where they basically showed that the 25 largest oil and gas companies are way off track from the Paris Agreement. We kind of course, knew all that, but that they are that far off track was something that was still surprising. And that was the first analysis also that did not just assess emissions targets. So often, you know, when we use or when we look at fossil fuel companies, we simply kind of look at, are your scope 1, 2, and 3 targets, are they Paris aligned? And obviously they are not for the big oil majors. But this study also kind of looked into executive numeration, project sanctions, production plans, investment options. And so it really was a more comprehensive analysis. And you see actually here from these takeaways, there were hardly any companies that really scored that really scored okay on that. And I think this is really something where we have quite a bit of problems sometimes, you know, talking to these kind of fossil fuel companies. And I know this here in Denmark, a lot of the pension funds, you know, they try to put pressure on them. But then, of course, you also have the problem that very often these companies are not really interested that much in change. So they try to keep the status quo. And this is what makes things so damn difficult. Let's move to April. So what caught my attention in April is also related to Switzerland, and I think this really hit the headlines back then. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled back then that climate change violates the right to respect for one's private and family life. The judge had ruled on a case when association of a Swiss elderly woman actually complained about the lack of sufficient government action against climate change. This was part of a broader lawsuit for the European Court of Human Rights, where also two other actually cases were put up. One case, for instance, by Portuguese youth, which was dismissed, but more actually on processual grounds rather than on substantive grounds. So the judges basically said, we cannot rule on this. You move too quickly into the European Court of Human Rights. Anyway, I think this was important because it sends clear messages. And we should not underestimate these rulings of the European Court of Human Rights and now also the International Court of Justice, which produces an advisory opinion. This might not have immediate and strong legal effects on all countries, but it creates, of course, cases which then is being referred to in future legislation. And that's why I think this was an important case. And I think it also sends the right message here. Let's move on. May. That was another really interesting study coming out in Nature at the time, because, you know, for many years, we always wondered, you know, what exactly will be climate change damages, and many figures kind of were circulating. What this study did, basically, it gave a very, very fine-grained view on climate change committed damages, because that was the first study that managed really to also use regional, very fine-grained regional data from over 1,600 regions in the world, and kind of research what are the economic income losses of climate change. So they ended up with an income reduction of 19% within the next 26 years. And what was shocking about this number really was that this is the number that is independent of future emission choices. So that basically means, regardless of what we do from here onwards, we are already committed to a 19% global income reduction. And of course, if you compare this with mitigation costs, you arrive at an enormously, at a quite significant economic case to address climate change now and not in the future. And I think this is something that a lot of people, are concerned with. So here, really fine-grained data. Also, it was taken up a lot in the media. The number and at the end that they calculated was 38 trillion US dollars by 2050. So these are the economic damages that are being estimated. And of course, this is a number that it will hit us, and it will hit us very, very hard. This is what the researchers are saying, and we need to start seriously preparing for that. And of course, you all know that we've all have been saying this for many years, and still not much has happened. Let's move to June. June was hotter than any other June on record, and I promise you, I think this is the only temperature-related news here, because we see a lot of these, and we've seen a lot of these throughout the last years, rightly so, because something happened to the temperature around mid-2023 that also climate scientists until today cannot fully explain. There are studies ongoing that try to really find out what exactly happened, because you really saw the significant jump in temperature. And yeah, so this is being researched right now, but it is quite clear that climate change and also temperature records are escalating. So what you're looking at here is ERA 5 data. So that comes out of the European Union's climate change service, Copernicus, and is one of a couple of large data sets that we have on climate. What we know by now is that not only June was hotter, but many other months throughout 2024 as well. So we will likely end up with a temperature of around 1.6 degrees anomaly. So that does not mean that the Paris Agreement is broken, because the Paris Agreement really looks at long-term temperature trends. But it means, of course, that we are in uncharted territory, and a lot of climate scientists right now are quite concerned about this. Important here, these are global temperatures. They look at the entire globe. Let's look into July. There was a bit at least here in Denmark, July is always vacation month, and what came out back then, and I remember I was on vacation, and I got also emails from a colleague actually working at ESG Book who did this graph here. They studied the current status of CSRD transposition into national law. So CSRD is the new reporting legislation that was put out by the European Union under the Green Deal. And what this basically shows is only 9 countries actually met the transposition deadline out of the 27 EU member states plus 3 EEA countries. In other words, quite a number of countries did not manage to transpose the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive on time into their national law, which is deeply frustrating. And it just shows, that also kind of these sustainability discussions often, in terms of priorities, they are simply not as prioritized as they should be in terms of national law. Some countries, unfortunately, have more or less ignored it. Portugal, for instance, being one where we see very little action around this. The EU then decided later on in the second half of the year to write infringement letters to these countries, basically kind of really telling them, if you don't kind of go on with transposition, we will reserve legal action. Nevertheless, it is frustrating, because at the end of the day, what we are trying to get is a better legal infrastructure for sustainability. And unfortunately, this is not always working the way it should be. Let's look into August. And what happened in August was quite interesting. I got my hands on some statistics that CEOs actually, because there was a study that looked at a number of other studies and kind of aggregated these, that CEOs' prioritization of sustainability is in sharp decline. So what they did here for this study was they aggregated a number of different studies into one coherent picture. The perceived importance of sustainability was and is overshadowed by a number of other things, mostly, of course, the geopolitical agenda, which was also high on the agenda in 2024, and it also impacted companies significantly. Artificial intelligence, inflation, economic concerns. So but what this also shows is that unfortunately the sustainability agenda is also a vulnerable agenda, at least in the boardroom and among CEOs. They have a lot on their plate, and if the importance of sustainability is overshadowed by other events, then this could also be interpreted as CEOs thinking rather short term and not long term enough. And that was for me also one takeaway when I discussed this with colleagues. They kind of said, well, you know, they're kind of changing too frequently. They do not kind of stick with priorities that were set. And we went through this ESG and sustainability hype a couple of years ago. Markets were very favorable, and now, you know, we do not do, or CEOs don't do what they're supposed to do to deliver on the targets that they set back then. Let's look into September. So September was interesting because that was when RepRisk actually released their greenwashing data, which they do once a year. And it was particularly interesting for Europe because the data showed actually a decrease in greenwashing cases for Europe. And the data does not tell us directly why this is the case. But one way to interpret this kind of decline in European greenwashing cases would be to kind of say companies simply are more careful these days when they put out green claims. And a lot of this, I think, has to do also with legislation that is on the horizon here in Europe. We already, in 2024, we got the Empowering Consumers Directive. We are likely to get the Green Claims Directive. Let's look at the new parliament and what they will do. And also, there are higher levels of transparency with different reporting frameworks. And I also see this if I talk to practitioners, that they tell me, look, I mean, we are getting more careful. We are more careful when we put out green claims, and I think in a sense this is a good development. It's actually good if the number of green claims is being reduced. We do not need more green claims. What we need is more substantive green claims, so that consumers really can make informed choices. Because this is something also that the EU is very concerned about in their policy making, that consumers lose trust. So a green claim would simply be if you make an environmental claim, a voluntary environmental claim on a product or service. So, you know, if you're not forced to make this claim, but if you kind of say, my eggs are climate neutral, right? This is a voluntary green claim. And the EU will kind of, or the EU said, what we need to do is we really need to check this a little more carefully because there is too much cheating going on here. So this might be first effects. As indicated, we need to interpret this carefully because the data doesn't tell us directly, but what we see really is, you see the green line here, this is a drop in cases in Europe. Let's look into October. That was also when COP16 kicked off. This is the biodiversity COP. Sometimes there's a bit confusion, also linguistic confusion around, you know, what actually is a COP. So Conference of the Parties meeting. Usually we use it in the climate context, so the big climate meeting once a year, but you have the same also for biodiversity. So this biodiversity meeting, so-called COP16, kicked off in October. And what was interesting then is that the FT kind of reported that many companies, you know, they jump on the nature positive bandwagon. So the share of corporates with nature-based goals is increasing. And that, of course, in principle is a good thing, but that also might create risks. We discussed greenwashing just in September, that they might not be able to live up to their goals because, you know, now nature positive and nature related goals are just something fashionable again, and companies commit to it often without reflecting sufficiently enough. And so when I posted this on LinkedIn, I think my concern was more how much of this will really lead to substantive actions at the end of the day, because we had seen actually very similar thing with net zero 12, 13 years ago when the net zero debate came around the corner. A lot of companies quickly made net zero commitments, and then they had to backtrack on these. It turned out a lot of them used offsetting, and there was a big debate around this. So in principle, it's a good idea that we see that companies are more responsive to this nature agenda, because I think it is such an important agenda, deeply interrelated also with climate. But we also need to be careful that firms don't overcommit. Let's move towards almost the end of the year, another really cool study that came out. So that was more or less a study that tried to summarize a lot of the work on carbon offsets. And what they found was, it was sadly actually not surprising, and still it was a good insight, that less than 60% of the issued carbon credits reflected real emission reductions. And that was really a large-scale systematic assessment of carbon crediting projects. So they looked at over 2,300 mitigation projects, which together accounted for nearly 1 billion tons of CO2, around 20% of the overall market. So that is actually quite significant. And we all know, or most of us know, that carbon offsets are not the way to go. They should only be used for residual emissions, or in cases, where you can really not find other solutions. And what this study kind of showed, there are many problems related to offsets. There are also some innovations coming around, and there are, I think, also some good developments. In December, then, during the climate COP meeting, they kind of created a market, a UN-based market for carbon offsets, so-called Article 6.2 and 6.4 carbon offsets. It's a bit technical, but so the UN kind of got involved in this debate as well, which probably is a good thing. At least to kind of boost legitimacy a bit. But this study clearly showed we need to be careful with regard to kind of believing that carbon offsets make a difference. Good. December then, yes, EU institutions finally reached an agreement, unfortunately, to delay the deforestation law by 1 more year. The interesting thing was that at the end, for me, and I follow these political debates very closely, it actually was a win. Because nobody wanted the delay, but there was a time that was early December when it came out that the newly elected European Parliament, and particularly the EPP, the European People's Party, so the conservative kind of part of the parliament, they pushed for significant other changes that they wanted to be part of this agreement. And this didn't go through. And that's why I say, so this ironically, at the end of the day, this 1 year delay was a win, because a lot of the other changes that were proposed, and I don't go into details here, they didn't make it through. So a lot of people back then kind of said, okay, we see this ironically actually as a win, because of course it's not good that it is delayed. It's also delayed for operational reasons, and actually some of the reasons can also be understood from an operational perspective, but at least the broader agenda did not come through. So good, we've gone through the year. 20 minutes.
Wonderful.
I kept my time.
And you gave us really lots of insights and on these all very interesting facts. But I think we also need a little bit the big picture now. Otherwise, our heads are probably a little bit fuming. So if you had to create a report card for humanity's progress on sustainability and planetary health this year, what grade would you give us and why?
How many grades are there on the card?
Let's make it from 1 to 10. Let's make it easy. 10 is the worst and 1 is the best.
I think we are still at 9 or 10. So I think we are absolutely not making progress. Let's face it. By the way, there is a nice, I will later have it in my links. There is a nice website called planetaryhealthcheck.org. This is basically Johan Rockström and kind of the people around him. They have this planetary health check. From a pure environmental perspective, we simply don't make progress. I mean, let's not fool ourselves here. Let's not kind of pretend anything that does not happen. There are very few the only indicator I can think of, and I've also seen in the State of Climate report earlier this year, that actually gives a bit of hope, is the uptake of EVs globally speaking. So electric vehicles, globally speaking, and of course, kind of renewable energy also starts to kick in. But in terms of emissions, biodiversity, and so on, we did not make progress. So we are still on the 9 to 10.
Wow,
I would say.
wow. And I think you just mentioned as well that the ocean line is soon going to be transgressed as well, which is really frustrating. But I mean, let me go just one step further, because if you think about the different sectors of society, I mean, you gave us now a 9 to 10, but let's look at governments, let's look at corporations. I mean, you're a professor of business in society, and individuals. If you could give them separate grades, who would be the honor student and who's skipping class entirely? So is there at least, should we at least say, well, let's back these up, and they are making progress a little bit?
Well, I think the laggards and those that basically remain stubborn and don't act are, of course, the big fossil fuel companies. They more or less keep their business model. They even expand their business despite knowledge by the International Energy Agency that this is not necessary, at least if we apply a 1.5 degree scenario. And I must say this year, in retrospect, has also brought about news that a lot of companies that used to be more on the progressive side have also scaled down their targets, their sustainability targets, right? I mean, look into Coca-Cola. Recently, this was in the news. They kind of scaled down their plastic targets. Look into Bank of America. So unfortunately, I must say that what used to be kind of a bit progression in the market has turned into a lot of companies not being as progressive anymore. What gives me hope often are these kind of smaller companies, smaller companies that really are active, that act on this agenda. You know, they might not report it, they might not report on it because they don't have to, but they nevertheless act on it because it is simply in their DNA, and it is simply, you know, a strong founder, a strong owner, kind of who keeps on driving this agenda. But I think with the big companies, we simply do not see the progress that we would need to see. There are few examples here in Denmark. We have some good examples, but even look at the almost the textbook example for a new energy company, Ørsted, which is a Danish energy company, which has turned from fossil into wind. They struggled a lot in 2024 because of the economic downturn, supply chain disruptions, higher interest rates, which is kind of toxic for the wind energy business.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, that is going to be one thing we might be having the possibility to discuss at the end, but you had it in one of your slides. They now, of course, have other problems, and this is of course compounding and is even going to the role models. Now Otti is very strongly asking things about the government, so let's have one question about the government. So let's just take his first one because they're all good. So he's asking, how effective is the enforcement of sustainability legislation across member states given the disparities in resources and political will? I mean, that was also something you already shown us, but if you look at the big picture here.
I mean, I'm not sure whether Otti means European member states or UN member states, but I mean, if we just look at the picture of enforcement, first of all, we need to look at the picture of regulation as such. And I must say, a lot of the regulation that we are seeing is regulations on disclosures, reporting. And let's not make the mistake here to kind of think reporting is impact. I'm always saying this also to my students who become very excited about the CSRD, and I tell them, look, that's good, and I buy that. That's fine, but you can report the hell out of each company without making any impact, right? So reporting is a means to an end. At the end of the day, we want more transparency, and that's why it's good. But governments don't do enough here. I mean, look at I showed this, you know, in the Europe. If you look at the European kind of continent, you see a very kind of patchy picture in terms of implementation. Some governments simply also reject this agenda because they're politically not aligned with it. Then, if you look over to the US, you see a new government coming in. And to be honest, what will happen with Trump? Let's see. I mean, a lot of people kind of speculate. I'm always a bit careful because a lot of people kind of think he will just disable a lot of the sustainability regulations. I'm not so sure about this, to be honest, because quite a bit of these regulations are actually profiting directly his kind of election base, Republican states. So if you look into the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a big which was a big regulation in the US, this profited predominantly Republican states. So Trump would be foolish to kind of abolish that in the end.
Well, we'll talk about that at the end of next year. So I'm just noting that down already. I think because I want to give you some time to go to this really nice list you prepared. So let's go to the list. So you prepared for us a naughty list. So who deserves a reprimand and why? So maybe you bring us through this.
Yes, I can discuss that a bit. The naughty list. Yes. So what was a bit disappointing? I already mentioned it. What was disappointing really is that quite a number of companies backtracked on their sustainability targets. And unfortunately, I must say, this is, it has many reasons. We also looked here at CBS, we looked a little closer into it. I think one reason is that a lot of companies realize, ooh, we had a 2025 target. We will not meet it for next year. We are way off track. So basically we have two options. Either we correct the target or we admit next year that we didn't meet the target. So their framing is quite interesting. For instance, Coca-Cola, they said, after many years of learning about kind of our sustainability activities, we decided that downscaling the plastics target is a good thing. But the question is, I mean, why does this happen now, right? It simply doesn't come across as authentic. COP29, number 2 here, that was a big disappointment, I must say. I was also here in the Danish media, one of those who kind of spoke out and said, I mean, we need significant commitments. As a bit of background, before COP29, the commitment was 100 billion in terms of climate finance until 2025. Hence, we needed a kind of a new goal. They came up with 300 billion committed to climate finance until 2035. So this is falling short very much of the financing needs, and not included in this number is also, by the way, any loss and damage funding. So what do we do with the kind of small island states? And we just had this morning the news of a cyclone kind of going over one of the Pacific islands. What do we do with these states and their extreme loss and damages? And how do we, from a pure also ethical perspective, how do we compensate these kind of countries for their damages? And this is something that politicians are very unwilling to discuss, because this is where really you talk about money and historical responsibility. I also see this here a bit in Denmark when you talk about because Denmark also has some oil in the North Sea, and if you talk about this and historical responsibilities, people are not keen on this. We had elections in the US and EU. These created new political environments, and we will see the effects of it in 2025. So in that sense, these kind of elections, what they will do, we will need to see in 2025. But I don't think they will change things to the better. Particularly in the EU, of course, we at the moment put the brakes on sustainability. I will say something about this later on. So that is a problem. What Trump will do, let's see. I mean, Trump, as within his first kind of tenure, he talks a lot and then sometimes he doesn't follow up on it. So, but I think it is clear that there will be changes also in the US to the sustainability agenda. Point number 4. What we have in the EU right now is this big discussion around competitiveness. The conservative and right-leaning companies and also business associations, they created this discourse probably in the second half of the year. This is fair to say that all these new regulations are a big burden on companies. They make them uncompetitive. So they try to push through, and wording here again is interesting, a simplification package. Let's see where they end up with this. And then, of course, big disappointment, 7th planetary boundary, ocean acidification, will be crossed in probably 1 to 2 years' time. We can also look at the other end, if you want me to.
Definitely. Let's go to the
nice list and
let's cheer a little bit. Yeah.
Yes. The nice list, yes. I mean, Europe passed the first law for protecting biodiversity, the nature restoration law. And that was for many, and also for me, that was a big moment. I mean, it was watered down, it was difficult discussions and so on, but hey, it's there. It is not what we all wanted in terms of achievement, but it is there and we can build on that. So that really is a landmark event. The UK shut down its last coal plant, marking the end of a 142-year era. So the UK at the moment does not kind of provide electricity through coal anymore, which is big. I mean, this is really significant. China sold more EVs than plug-in hybrids than petrol cars. In the first half of the year, we got that kind of statistics earlier this year. I think this is very promising. Of course, it also shows the Chinese state kind of backs this a lot. They pump a lot of money into these technologies. On the international and global level, it also kind of causes some conflicts with European car manufacturers. Hence, we've seen tariffs that are kind of being put up by the EU. But overall, this is good. I mean, it's pushing this technology into the mainstream. Biodiversity has moved more into the focus area, but it has also been misused for branding purposes. And I'm always cautioning here, hey, let's not misuse the biodiversity agenda as we did with the climate agenda in the early days. Let's not make the same mistakes again here. So I think that's important. And EU regulators in general have stepped up on sustainability. Non-EU regulators, so the US and China. But let's see. I mean, this will also then depend in the US quite a bit on what Trump does. What I hear is also that he might restrict the ability of these Securities and Exchange Commission, the stock market regulator, to actually regulate ESG related things. So we will also see headwinds, but as such, actually, also non-EU regulators have done something. So this is not just EU, and this is not just some crazy Europeans doing something. It is a global movement in the end.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, and I'm really glad that we have the nice list, so gives a little bit of an uplift. But unfortunately, I want to drill down a little bit more on where we can do things better, and I think I want to go to the individuals and then to education, because after all, you're of course an associate dean, etc. So you must have some ideas here as well. So when it comes to individuals, so what's the most common excuse you hear for our inaction on climate change, and how should we overcome that?
I think the most common excuse I hear is often I don't think my voice makes a difference. I don't think I make a difference, right? I'm one among millions of people, and hence what I say or do is actually irrelevant. I also see it with my friends who kind of say, look, whether I change my flying behavior, that doesn't make a difference, right? So, and we know this kind of pattern, and also it, Antoinette, from studies on consumer boycotts, where we have the same hurdle, right, that needs to be overcome. And I think it is difficult to tackle, but I think, again, this is where education comes in. You need to tell people, look, yes, you are one of many, but you actually make a difference with your individual behavior. You make a difference. And I think this is where we are probably not doing a good enough job. Also to bring it into school education and early on then in universities. I'm always saying, the people that we get here in universities, very often they already hold very strong views, either pro or against sustainability. So
yeah, you're right. And I think schools and early on, and maybe even kindergarten, that would be a very important place, but still in universities as well. And you are, like I am, working in a business school. So I'm just wondering whether you're a little bit more satisfied with what your business school is doing, and where you see the biggest gap right now in our, I mean, you are in a full-time MBA education. What could we do better? What would be for all business schools very important to do?
Well, I think, to the first part of your question, what we do at CBS here, I think it is good. So I think, but we also push for it a lot. So we push for it. We have the buy-in of senior management for it. So that I think is good. And we also position the school a little bit kind of on this cutting edge. with regard to sustainability, ethics, responsibility. But of course, we also have our problems. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. I mean, we also kind of have programs in our portfolio that are not overly responsive to this. Looking into education in general, what you ask, you know what? I think the biggest hurdle is not the curriculum. It's what I call sometimes the hidden curriculum. The implicit messages that we send to students while they are on campus, while we talk to them in the classroom about sustainability and responsibility and ethics and so on. So, and what I mean with these implicit messages is students will only buy into sustainability, ethics, etc., if we are consistent in terms of how we frame things. If one professor tells them, look, I mean, this is very important, and then they move, then they have a 15-minute break, and then they have their one-on-one economics lecture, and the professor there tells them exactly the opposite, then this hidden curriculum is simply not working in the way it should. So what I mean is we really need to send the right messages. Or another example is the schools by themselves, they also need to walk the talk. Students become enormously cynical about this. We at CBS here until 7-8 years ago, we had a lecture room that was sponsored by British American Tobacco. And I'm serious. I had to teach CSR. When I came here, I was made, I had to teach CSR in this lecture room. And then there was a debate in the school, do we want this? Who do we want to partner with? And what messages do we send to the students, to external audiences, and so on? And I think this was a very healthy debate, and we made the right choice back then. But this is what I mean, this broader cultural accomplishment of teaching these things in a university, but also in schools, not just university.
Yeah, I'm taking it up because now, of course, somebody's also asking, what can you do to tackle the hidden curriculum? So I am wondering, for instance, do you also have alternative economics? And we only have, we don't have heterodox economics, for instance. Or would it be that we have to make sure that us professors are maybe engaging more together? So, which is also very difficult. I mean, we know both how universities and business schools are functioning. Or maybe a last one, would we have to go out of the rankings and make sure that we have a different type of research, which then would also allow us to tackle that?
Lots of questions. Maybe let's start in the back with the rankings. Rankings, I think it depends quite a bit on which ranking and what they do. I almost paradoxically, you know what, within our little call here, I can say it, I hate the FT ranking. I mean, I really do. It's just like not my kind of thing. The Financial Times ranking, because they overvalue salary increase, and I just do not think that this is the way that you measure progress or quality. Take your pick. Nevertheless, this ranking is actually the ranking that pushes quite a bit towards sustainability performance. For instance, they require an audited climate report of a school, and that helped us here in Copenhagen a lot when you know, talking to senior management, kind of saying we want that, we need that, because also the rankings demand it. So it depends a bit. There are positive and negative effects. In terms of lectures, yes, I mean, we also have, of course, lectures that look much beyond Economics 101, but probably like in your institutions as well, usually students are not just exposed to those, but then also exposed to kind of more traditional content. And then often it is up to the students to kind of make up their mind. And a lot of students then are confused. They kind of say, well, now I heard kind of traditional welfare economics, neoclassical economics, so I had my lecture there, and then I had another lecture, and it is difficult to integrate this in a coherent way. So I think what we need to also come to one of the questions that you asked, yes, we need much more coordination also among faculty. We need to sit down and we need to coordinate. And I don't think that this is done enough in universities. We need to sit down, coordinate, exchange, and kind of also think about what kind of final message do we want to send to students. I do this quite a bit in my own program here, the MBA. But I think overall, my feeling sometimes is we could do it more, because I'm also teaching on other programs where this is not done as much.
Yeah, I think we are not unlike companies, as you have already found out, very short-term oriented. Some figures are in the foreground, and that sometimes prevents us to really go into the discussion about content and about the future. I think that's sadly probably in most universities, but certainly even more in business schools. Now, maybe we take up another question, which is also coming up quite often on the chat, and this has something to do with the justice question. So, for instance, Mark is asking, is sustainability also a matter of redistribution of wealth? I mean, it's not, probably not only justice, but there are several aspects here.
I think it is. At the end of the day, it is, because we cannot really achieve sustainability with the current distribution of wealth. That unfortunately is the harsh reality. If you just look at the data, it is not possible that 9 billion people on the planet live with the same kind of unjust distribution of wealth. This would kind of put us into or even more severe problems. So I think the both genders are related, also because I think the problem or the fact that we have such an unjust distribution of wealth is putting the brakes on solutions to many sustainability problems. And I think what we need at the end of the day is we really need to redistribute and also to some degree degrow. I think we overconsume, we overproduce, but unfortunately, and that's the big elephant in the room. Whenever politicians kind of get to these kind of insights, they do not act on it, right? They do not redistribute significantly through different kind of tax systems or windfall taxes of profits. There are some exceptions to this. The UK government, for instance, has windfall taxes on oil and gas producers. But I mean, these are very, very tiny exceptions. So definitely, both agendas are deeply interrelated, justice and inequality and sustainability. And by the way, also growth and sustainability. We cannot grow as we used to grow and be sustainable in the long run. That simply doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering, when I studied, that's really a very, very long time ago, we already talked about changes in taxations, where, for instance, you would go more towards resource use rather than labor, where you would also try to make sure that you have carbon taxes. A lot of these things have been around for ages, and that could be then also used for redistribution for some part, but it's just not happening. And I'm sometimes, I mean, deep down, beyond that, we have, of course, a lot of different interests. What do you believe is really holding us back to be a little bit more innovative and try out, for instance, different tax systems in governments?
Greed. I think it is greed to some degree.
Okay.
It is the greed, and probably also to some degree the lack of or lacking willingness really to accept better arguments on or political ideologies that stand in the way of accepting other arguments. So I think what we've seen over the last years is we've seen this enormous polarization in the political discourse also around some of these questions. And that doesn't help, right? I mean, we are not used anymore to really kind of trying to search for common ground. And I think such deliberation, my early work was very much on the idea of Habermas and discourse ethics, and where you kind of have almost an ideal situation where you exchange. This is not happening. I mean, if you look at how people behave these days, also in politics, this is pure self-interest. Greed is included in there, and then also heavy political ideologies. And I'm sorry to say so, but everything that we've seen throughout 2024, for instance, by the German liberals, right? I don't want to just punch on them, but unfortunately, it goes to some degree. It goes down to how they behave here in Europe. These are probably the two biggest impediments. But I mean, I don't have empirical evidence for them. There might also be other impediments for it.
Well, no, I mean, I think Otti, and he might come in a second anyhow, because he's going to move over to the next section. He once told me, and I think he's right, that today's conservatives are conserving neoliberalism rather than trying to conserve conservative values, for instance, or nature. And I think that might be one of the reasons what we have in the background, that, and neoliberalism, of course, there we are, where you were just saying it's the individual, it might be greed, it's competition, and that, of course, is producing some of the problems. But yeah, so I was probably leading you astray a little bit, because we are now very deep, and I think we should now move to the next section.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, what a great conversation. And I think, Andreas, if you don't mind, we're going to send you all the chat questions. And I think that there are lots more, and many are very interesting. So I think this nicely leads us into the next section. With the question, the section now is basically about what we can do. And we had two little topics. The first is Christmas season doesn't seem to be the most sustainable anymore, all right, since we've commercialized it so much. So I think the first question here is, how can we turn Christmas into something which is more sustainable? But secondly, also looking into next year, and we come to the outlook after this session, what could be some useful commitments? And I think on the chat that was already anticipated, that we could all make, either individually or as businesses, to help improving the situation. And I want to start with you, Andreas. So maybe you recently published a post on kind of your personal lessons learned from looking at what was happening throughout the year. So maybe let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, on the lessons learned, that was a summary of 5 studies that moved me quite a bit on the climate agenda, by the way, that I put out on LinkedIn. But I actually reviewed quite a bit of these already in the slides. So I think the basic message is there is reason for hope. Why? Because people care. But there is also reason for being concerned, or a lot of reasons for being concerned, because we don't move. And the little bit that we move is incremental into compared to the kind of scale of the problem. So the scale of the problem and our solutions simply don't fit together. Christmas, less presents. I think I'm. It's not happy news for my son. So I mean, but I think to make it a little bit more sustainable, less presents, and maybe buy them locally. You know, don't buy them via Amazon or these kind of outlets, because support your local retailer, support your local farm. If you have one around the corner, that sometimes makes more of a difference. New Year's resolution, difficult. I mean, there are many things we can do, and of course, we can say, you know, put up solar panels if you have the need. But I think one thing that is always underestimated and actually quite impactful is put pressure on your pension to really decarbonize their portfolios, because this is something that we don't do enough, and this is something where collectively a significant impact can be created. And it depends a bit on the country where you are and kind of the pension system that they have. But I'm always saying, you know, the leverage that we have through our pension is actually quite significant. And maybe in the new year, just think about what you could do, and whether there is a channel to communicate with your pension provider on this. If it is a state-based provider, it's a little more difficult. But here in Denmark, for instance, we have pension funds, so you can write to them or you can make your choices, and that sometimes is a bit easier.
Let's pick up the finance subject, because I know that you're interested in that as well. So where do you see finance come in being a positive force for change rather than making things worse?
Well, I think there has been this entire ESG agenda. We had this ESG hype, I would say, over the last, and it was 21, 22, where almost anything was labeled ESG and the market was exploding. I think what 24 has shown is that we have gone a bit down to more realistic levels. I think financing is so important, because at the end of the day, this is how you get the change going. The change costs money. The EU Green Deal, to which a lot of the regulations that I discussed earlier, to which this relates. this costs around 600 billion euros per year. And we need private financing for that. This cannot be paid by governments. So finance really makes a difference. And I think the problem that I'm always having is, how do we get those really mainstream investors on board, and on board in a way that they also buy not just into risk, but also into impact? Because if you talk to people from BlackRock, they would say, sure, climate is important, and I fully see this, as long as it is a risk and the risk is financially material to the investments. We are happy to act. If you want to have an impact discussion with them, it's really more difficult, because they do not really see this as their mandate, also legally speaking, by the way. So we also need politicians to kind of provide a little bit more space for investors to kind of go into the impact route. So we have some regulations, and I saw a little bit on the chat some comments there. SFDR, true, SFDR, which is a transparency regulation for the finance sector, which is good. It provides a lot of transparency. That's excellent. We have a new regulation on ESG ratings. You know, everybody was talking about ratings and so on, and that, you know, ratings are not very reliable, so they will be regulated, at least here in Europe. So that's okay. But at the end of the year, but at the end of the day, of course, we need to recognize that there is still a long way to go until finance really becomes truly supporting actor in the sustainable transition. Right now, I think a lot of what we label ESG is simply not credible enough. A lot of this is in passive funds, so index tracked funds, and the effects there are not as big as we want them to be. So we really need to move impact into this finance field in a more scalable manner.
Which, I mean, I'm always surprised if people are surprised, right? So if you look at the evolution of CSR and triple bottom line, and then at some point ESG, I mean, ESG was invented by, I always say, us, right? Being a banker in my last job, at least, right? It wasn't invented by banks, and it's a risk mitigation approach. It was never, I mean, with all the positioning aside, it is not meant really to be a save the world type of framework. It's meant to be a save my profit long-term type of framework. And that's just a very different starting point, which again, I think to your earlier point, is some of these moral considerations and emotions play a role, then don't look to ESG to bring them up, as far as I'm concerned. But maybe people are thinking whether they want to ask a question. I have another one, which Antoinette and I and Kees, who sadly cannot be here today, we interviewed Walter Starhill last week. And Walter is, of course, one of the gurus who brought up the circularity economics framework. And one of the big topics we looked at was waste. And there was a comment on the chat also about plastic waste in particular, right? But if you look at how much waste we are producing, the forecasts where no peaking is in sight, the damage it's doing, including things like PFAS, is there some problem with targeting net zero or net positive type of frames vis-a-vis net waste? So is there more required, at least when it comes to waste production, or do we need to rethink how we're targeting sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I'm not an expert on the waste or circularity agenda. So usually the academic discussions there, I leave them to other people. But I think the problem I see on the waste side, for instance, here in Denmark, is that we still burn too much of it, right? I mean, it's simply collected, also sorted in a lot of ways, and then it's burned. So that of course is not really the solution. So I think to achieve true circularity, I think we also need to have this mindset shift on the individual level, that people kind of also recognize whenever waste is there and whenever they produce waste with their actions. And I think this is something on the individual side where we are probably not conscious enough.
Yeah, I was flabbergasted when I looked at the statistics and the models and the forecasts, I mean, the amount of waste we're producing is just ghastly, so to speak.
It's ridiculous, yeah. It's ridiculously high.
Yeah, I mean, it's reckless. And the consumerism, I think maybe there's Frederic Laloux, I think, with this new initiative, I think it's called The Wave, is giving people a glimpse of the suffering that we're creating, and maybe we need to re-emphasize the connection between our own actions and the suffering, the problems it's causing elsewhere, right? Rather than take the it's out of our way, it's out of our mind approach that we are very often having as consumers, at least. But with that, I think what we're going to do, let's maybe quickly go through the suggestions for making Christmas more sustainable. Let's have a quick look at the chat. Paul was challenging us and saying Christmas was it ever sustainable? I think that's a good question. Antoinette was countering that certainly in the post-war years when we didn't have money, it was kind of de facto more sustainable. But I think maybe let's pick our preferred ideas from the chat as to what good presents could be, and then we go into the forward-looking section of 2025, what's coming up. Let's have a quick look. Any gifts that anyone thinks are worth pointing to? So I see more. Tobias is saying just simply more time together. Clemens is saying time for relatedness and connection. That seems a good idea. Bas is saying non-plastic, bio-based dishes. A sanding thing, what that might be, but it sounds sustainable. Stefan is saying a big hug. Well, okay. I think the problem with all these things is if you have children and so on, I don't think they would be satisfied, especially looking at their colleagues.
But for children, you can really go to the WWF Junior Club, so they love that, for instance, just to give you an example.
WWF Junior Club, yeah, okay. Tanya is saying hope. I think that's certainly something that we need. Ketil is saying theater tickets. Well, that might be another one if the theater is indeed is sustainable. Luna is saying as well, trip to the theater together. Trying to embed sustainability in business operations. We're going to come to that. Adina has no idea yet. Vanya is saying walking together. So spending time together seems to be a big thing, which reminds me of the conversation we recently had with the Cardinal of the Vatican, who's kind of saying we can only get the Monday right if we get the Sunday right. And the Sunday is the contemplation, is the calmness, the walking together, so and maybe thinking a little bit more about our lives and what we're doing. So that seems like a very good advice. And then what else have we got? Sustainable household, a metal plate from a flea market. So if you're buying things, use used items is what Judith is saying. I think that's a very good point. So reuse and repair rather than buy new stuff. And then Frank has been baking. I think that's another very good thing, right? So rather than buying stuff and things, do something yourself. And that's certainly something that in the old days we often did. Anything else, Andreas, that you've picked up in terms of ideas from the chat? Self-made ones.
I think you got it all. And of course, I mean, this kind of spending time together, doing something together. I always give my wife some sort of kind of event or you know, related things, theater, a nice dinner, a walk in the park. I mean, these things are I think absolutely undervalued, and in this sense, we should, maybe this is the biggest gift, if you really spend time with each other.
Yeah, no
But you then also have to follow it up, haven't you, Andreas? Because I can remember how often I got this. We're going to do this, and then of course it didn't happen. But anyway,
give away cards.
Yeah. Some used books could be idea. Paul is saying hope is not a strategy. I think there's something true in that, but sometimes hope could also be very active. Now, one thing I would say though is and maybe let's close this session off here again with in terms of can we really make a difference? So what I'm seeing is a lot of relational things, and that's of course what Christmas is about. But if I look at the kind of the symbolism of the cross, right, being Christmas, at least here in the Western Hemisphere, being a religious celebration, and the transcendence that is implied by the sign of the cross has the horizontal line, which is the neighbor, right, is with each other, but it's legitimized by the vertical line, which is the divine love, right? So love thy neighbor as you love thy God. So there's something here where the relational aspect should lead us to transcendence. And I'm wondering if we do these relational things in Christmas, that might help to make Christmas more sustainable, but it's not calling us into responsibility to take care of the global challenges that we have. So shouldn't we not, Andreas, final question here, should we not join a political party? Do we not also have to use the relational aspects to become participatory in society? Is that not almost a requirement for us to make a difference that goes beyond our household?
Definitely. I mean, we as citizens, you know, we have rights, but we also have duties, and the duty is also to participate in the political process. We don't need to join a political party for that. I'm always saying, you know, there is so much also consultation. For instance, I can mostly speak for the EU processes and how they work. You can voice your concerns. I'm not sure how much each individual is heard, because they always look for patterns, obviously, but there are ways to voice also individual concerns, to give feedback on these processes. And I think at the end of the day, this kind of active engagement in policy making is a wonderful way also to express, first of all, your values, your opinions, but also to some degree shape these processes.
Yeah, excellent. I think I feel the same. I think I certainly will ponder over the Christmas period whether to join a political party, which is not really where my heart is, but I almost feel, like you say, a duty to participate in a meaningful way in political process. And I need to see what the alternatives are. But with that, thank you everybody for the challenges, but also the great ideas. And I would suggest let's have a look at 2025. Then we're going to open the Christmas crackers, which in today's format will be Andreas's top 10 of resources that you might want to have a look at to be better informed about the conversation. And I will remind you of the link to Andreas's blog that we are mirroring on our website. And then we're going to close it off. So Andreas, over to you again to a quick brief look at 2025.
All right. Yes, 2025, lots of things. And again, incomplete list here. Probably what is on a lot of people's mind right now, also after the last 2 weeks, is what the International Court of Justice will do with regard to its advisory opinions on countries' legal obligation vis-a-vis climate change. That will be interesting to see. It is just an advisory opinion, but as I said earlier, these things matter. They have a lot of authority, also a certain moral authority that comes with it. So let's see. Unfortunately, I followed it on the sidelines, not in The Hague, but on the sidelines. And what you saw is a lot of countries really pushing back on their potential obligations. So let's see what the judges make out of this. The EU will make vital decisions around a number of different regulations. Unfortunately, it looks like that this 2035 petrol car ban that was agreed upon might be reopened because the new parliament, so the one that Europe elected earlier this year, is keen on that. This is of course a bit disappointing because it also sends the wrong signals to the automotive industry. Actually, they would need help to move towards EVs and to kind of have a fair competition with other major players in the world. What they don't need now is a lot of uncertainty with politicians kind of revising a law that they already agreed on 2 to 3 years ago. COP30 in Brazil. Yeah, we're not entirely sure what exactly the focus will be. There are some new kind of what is called NDCs, national determined contributions, which countries have to submit in 2025. But let's see what will come out of it. I certainly hope that this COP will be less of a, how should I put it, public media event than the 2 prior COPs, particularly with the one in Dubai. COP28, I had the feeling, I think there were like 80 or 90,000 people there. And the question really was, what good is that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is a political negotiation here. And there were, I think it was, the picture was blurred quite a bit of a lot of people kind of being there particularly also lobbyists, particularly also companies who, from my perspective, actually do not necessarily should have a seat on the table. Well, they didn't have a seat on the table, but they were, of course, there and doing their lobbying behind the scenes. Further need to harmonize regulations, globally speaking, I think that probably is important, because what you hear from companies, rightly so, too many different regulatory frameworks across the world make life very, very difficult. And last but not least, human rights related topics may be better integrated. I think hopefully we will see kind of a renaissance almost of the human rights agenda. On the sustainability space, we've been very heavy on the environmental, on the E side over many years due to the kind of dominance of the climate discourse. But I also see now that more and more people think about the interrelationship between the environmental and the social. And I think that is something to watch out for in 2025, that we hopefully see also more discussions about what are the human rights consequences of some of the environmental problems and how do we deal with these.
Excellent. And I was almost about to say, let's hope the COP is not going to be a cop-up again. But yeah, I think there is indeed a challenge. I think what someone suggested also, the housing of these COPs in states or under the supervision of oil countries or oil companies is a bit of a joke, right?
It is. Yeah. It is. It was with Dubai. It was with Azerbaijan. Brazil also it's not a true petrol state, but it also, of course, has a lot of production. I don't see that much of a problem with Brazil, but I see a problem that these events are kind of captured by corporate and also business associations, whereas in the narrow sense, of course, these should be political negotiations.
Yeah, and the numbers are stunning, right? I think in one of your blogs, it was 3,500 lobbyists and more. And the greatest amount of lobbyists at this last COP in Baku. It's just showing where it's going, and of course the political nature, as you point out, is attracting that type of lobbying. But
indeed,
very nice. Then I think let's go to the top 10 resources and see a little bit. I found it together with Antoinette in case when we were preparing our research for the Business for Humanity interviews. It very often crosses over with topics that you're writing about. And I sometimes find it really hard to get an unbiased and effective perspective on where things are going. So would be really interesting to get your ideas here. And also maybe if someone really doesn't have a lot of time but wants to stay connected, right, beyond looking at your own blogs, and what are the out of the 10 once you've explained them, what are the 1 or 2 that people should really bookmark?
I think Carbon Brief, I really like Carbon Brief a lot. It's a UK kind of think tank, I would say. They do a lot of very accessible also analysis on climate change, lots of kind of really straightforward questions also. Things like, you and I, we care about, like, are EVs really more climate friendly than petrol cars? Because there's so much discussion around it. So they look at this, they analyze it, and then they tell you what their results are. So I think I love Carbon Brief. They really do a great job. By the way, also covering COPs. So whenever you have a COP going on, they do kind of really good coverage. Skeptical Science is really cool for fending off climate denialism. So whenever you have people who come to you with kind of these things, yeah, but we always had ice ages and the climate was always fluctuating, they have a great list of so these are the 10 most used arguments by climate deniers, and this is the scientific evidence that goes against it. And it's really kind of scientists behind this who write that kind of who write the rebuttals, so to say. So it is good quality. Planetary Health Check. This is around planetary boundaries. It just came live earlier this year. Really cool website by Johan Rockström and team on the planetary boundaries and how they develop. So this will be kind of continuously updated. And the Oxford Climate Policy Monitor, if you're interested in these kind of policy dimension. But maybe as a last thing, what I like personally quite a bit is artists and climate change, simply for a change sometime to kind of see how do artists actually deal with climate change in very different ways. And it is a website certainly worth looking for.
Very interesting. I think one debate that will continue, and you and I also discussed it a little bit throughout this year, is the bringing together of the environmental, ecological, and social data. And I think I think Bas was it and others on the chat were challenging. So how does social justice and environmental justice come together? What are the relationships there? And maybe also what is a consolidated policy framework that we need to develop? It's very hard, I think. It's certainly something that is very interesting to look at further.
Yeah.
Good. And with that, I think, Andreas, we're almost at the end. I just want to remind everybody that we have a little collaboration going on, because I think another important aspect is that we cannot change the world by ourselves, right? And frankly, this idea of an Immanuel Kantian environmental man, the polymath who will understand every single thing and can rationally come to conclusions on every single problem around the planet, it's just nonsense, right? The things are too complicated, too complex. We cannot in our lifetimes accrue enough knowledge to be knowledgeable on every single topic. And also we cannot act individually just to make systemic change happen. So we need to work together. We need to create coalitions amongst each other. And a little bit with you, Andreas, and thank you for that. We are trying to bring together people who we think have very solid and well-researched opinions, but also can bring together, as you pointed out, their ethics with your discourse ethics and your training in ethics, politics and economics, to really offer others a believable knowledge base that they can use to adjust their own actions. It's sometimes hard to find credible information. So I want to just point people again to the mirroring of your blogs. Subscribe to Andreas on LinkedIn if you haven't. Secondly, you will always find, I try to consolidate it every 2 weeks, depending on how much Andreas is writing, on sustainability.leadershipsociety.world. You will find the whole archive of blogs. I also want to briefly let you know that the next regular session of Business for Humanity is going to be super interesting. I mean, we're very happy to and pleased to have some of the most prominent and interesting academics and activists to join us. The next session is going to be on January 20th with Anne Pettifor. And I think Anne is really interesting, not only being a strong promoter of the New Green Deal, but also in her critique of banking and finance, which Andreas, you already alluded to. So I'm looking forward to I'm sure controversial, but very intriguing session with Anne in January. And you can find all the details on the series. And again, all the materials are there, freely available, the transcripts, the resources, the videos, etc., on businessforhumanity.world. That brings us to the end. And Andreas, I'll stop sharing here. I just want to thank you again on behalf of the whole team for having kind of allowed us not only to use your posts in our sessions, but also to be with us here. Before we go to holiday greetings, is there a final recommendation, advice that you have, especially I would say this time for business leaders, if they want to become better and more sustainable in running their businesses? What is it you suggest they should be doing? Where do they start? What learnings can you share with them?
I think a good strategy is or something that I come across quite often is that they sometimes should start with their own humbleness. And being humble enables actions, and being humble also, I think, maybe makes them a little bit more authentic in this corporate sustainability space. And what we don't need is more of this win-win kind of talk that we see so often. So this humbleness, also vis-a-vis nature and vis-a-vis the massive problems that we are facing, I think is something that would be good to have it from more leaders.
Wonderful. A bit more humbleness, a bit more care. I see Antoinette is strongly of the same opinion. I strongly agree, and I want to emphasize your message. I don't often agree with the church, but here the old Pope said, charity in truth. There's something about caring and searching for truth, which triggers some dialectics, triggers some development in a different kind of stance toward the world and trying to make our actions sustainable and just. And with that, Andreas, thank you very much. Everybody, thank you for participating, and we will forward all the many questions that you have to Andreas to maybe have a look at them in the new year. We wish you all the very best for a sustainable holiday season. And please, at the end of the year, think about your personal commitments to help us all. As Paul said, it's not enough to hope. We need to put that hope into action. So please help us doing so, and let's make the world of business a tiny little bit better. With that, happy holidays, Merry Christmas. Speak to you all soon in 2025. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much all.
Bye-bye.
Merry Christmas.
9 activists marching, 8 forests burning, 7 seas rising, 6 droughts a scorching, 5 fossil fuels,